Welcome back to the deep dive. We are genuinely thrilled to have you back with us diving into these, well, pretty deep waters of knowledge. Your curiosity really does drive this whole thing.
It really does. And a big thank you to everyone tuning in, new subscribers, folks hitting like, and especially those leaving comments. We see them, we read them.
Absolutely. Your questions, your insights, it's fantastic. It really pushes us to dig deeper, So thank you, really.
We love exploring those what-ifs,
Yeah.
the things that maybe don't fit the neat boxes. It's great having such an engaged community along for the ride.
Totally agree. And speaking of digging deeper, if you were with us last time, you'll remember our deep dive, Younger Dryas' first reset of civilization.
Right, where we looked at that massive climate shift and how it might have, well, basically wiped the slate clean for human history, maybe hiding an earlier chapter.
Exactly, a potential first major reset. Well, today we're taking the next step. This is part 2, really, in our Civilization Resets series. We're calling this one Sumerian Genesis Second Reset of Civilization.
It feels like a necessary follow-up, doesn't it? If history isn't just a straight line-up, then these big breaks, these potential resets, become crucial to understand. And Sumer is central to that.
It absolutely is. But here's the thing about this one. We realized pretty early on that just sticking to the usual suspects, mainstream science, standard archaeology, it just wasn't going to give us the full picture. Not for this.
No, the standard explanations only go so far, especially when you encounter some of the, let's say, stranger details in the Sumerian records.
Right. So to really get under the skin of this second civilization reset, we had to go off the beaten path. We actually managed to dig up what I can only describe as a really mysterious archive.
Yeah, mysterious archive feels about right. It's not just one source. It's this collection of ancient texts, some almost forgotten, combined with some very unconventional but really thorough research.
Exactly. Stuff that really challenges the standard historical timeline. And this archive, it gave us a much, much richer and honestly a pretty unsettling perspective on what might have happened back then, way beyond the usual narrative.
So yeah, prepare yourselves. What we found in this archive, it might make you rethink, well, quite a lot about the story we've been told about human civilization.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where do we start unraveling this Sumerian puzzle? It begins with a document, a physical artifact that seems straightforward at first. We're talking about the Sumerian King List, the SKL.
And this isn't some, fringe text whispered about in corners. This is real. It's physical. We have copies inscribed in cuneiform, the first writing system, remember, on actual clay tablets and prisms.
Like the Weld-Blundell prism, right? That's a famous one.
Exactly. Found in Larsa, modern Iraq, back in 1922. And it's not hidden away. It's sitting right there in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Mainstream historians work with this all the time.
So let's be crystal clear. This isn't a myth, not a poem. It reads like a formal record. Scribes put this together meticulously. It lists kings, cities they ruled from, how long they reigned.
Compiled from different sources across Sumer, but they all basically tell the same core story. It looks like history. Except
for the kicker, the part that just makes your brain glitch. This list, this historical document, it claims some of the earliest kings ruled for, well, tens of thousands of years each.
Startling. You look at Alulin, the first king listed in the city of Eridu, reign. 28,800 years.
28,000.
800, yeah. Then his successor, Aluljar, 36,000 years. And it keeps going. And Mendelana gets 43,200 years. These numbers are just impossible by any human standard we know.
It completely breaks the frame, doesn't it? I mean, why would the Sumerians, the people who gave us writing, law, astronomy, cities, the foundations of so much, why record that? With such precision, specific cities, exact year counts.
Right. If it was just, flowery myth-making, why the detail? Why list Eridu, then Bad Tibera, then Larak? Why the specific numbers? It doesn't feel like pure fantasy.
So how do mainstream historians usually handle this? What's the standard explanation for these absurd reigns?
Well, the common approach is to label that early pre-flood section as purely symbolic, maybe mythological, representing a golden age perhaps, or trying to legitimize later rulers by giving them this incredibly ancient lineage.
So they just say the numbers are exaggerated, hyperbole.
But pretty much.
Yeah.
That they didn't have a literal concept of time back then, or these numbers meant something else entirely, like maybe power or prestige, not actual years.
Yeah.
But that feels a bit convenient, doesn't it?
It does, because like you said, the rest of the list, the later kings.
Exactly. The list flows seamlessly from these godlike reigns right into kings whose reigns are much shorter, much more human scale. And those later kings, we often have other proof they existed, other inscriptions, archaeological finds.
So if the bottom part of the list is demonstrably real history, recorded with the same style and precision,
why automatically dismiss the top part as pure fiction? Just because the numbers are uncomfortable? The archive we looked into suggests maybe we shouldn't dismiss it so quickly. Maybe we just don't understand what those numbers mean yet.
And it gets even weirder, or maybe clearer, depending on how you look at it. The list itself draws a massive line in the sand. It splits the timeline in two, explicitly.
Yes, it states very clearly. Rulers before the flood and rulers after the flood.
The flood. That rings a bell, doesn't it? It's not just a Sumerian thing.
Not at all. That's what's so fascinating. This idea of a great world-altering flood. It's everywhere. Noah in the Bible, obviously. Manu in the Hindu texts. Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is Mesopotamian itself.
So many cultures seem to have this deep memory of a massive deluge.
Almost universal, yeah. From the Americas to Asia, it suggests some kind of shared, ancient, traumatic event that got encoded into myth and legend worldwide.
And the Sumerians didn't just remember it, they built their entire history around it. The King List adds up the reigns of the first 8 kings, totaling 241,200 years, by the way.
Which is just, yeah, mind-boggling number.
And then, bam, it just says, the flood swept over. End of chapter 1.
And what happens immediately after that line in the text is maybe the most crucial part. Suddenly, the reigns listed become shorter, dramatically shorter.
Like believable lengths.
Exactly. You go from tens of thousands of years to maybe hundreds, then quickly down to dozens. Kings ruling for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. Human lifespans. It's such a stark contrast right there in their own record.
It's like a switch flips. Before the flood, impossible reigns. After the flood, looks like actual history.
And here's something that gives this ancient story a bit more weight, something the archive highlights. There's actual geological evidence of major flooding in Mesopotamia, right around 2900 BCE, which fits the general time frame that scholars often associate with the flood layer in the archaeological record there.
So rocks and sediment seem to back up the story, at least partially.
The scale and exact nature are debated, of course, in mainstream circles. Was it the global flood? Probably not in the way it's often pictured, but was there catastrophic flooding in that region significant enough to leave a permanent mark geologically and culturally? The evidence suggests yes.
Which really blurs that line between myth and memory, doesn't it? Maybe these myths are just history that sounds too strange for us to accept.
So if the flood was this massive turning point, who were those guys ruling before it? The ones with the crazy long reigns?
Right. The list itself gives a clue, a really provocative one. It says, and this is a direct quote, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu."
Descended from heaven. That phrasing is loaded. It pretty clearly implies these rulers weren't, local folks who rose through the ranks.
Not from around here, basically.
Exactly. It suggests an off-world origin, or at least something other than human as we typically define it. Kingship itself, the authority to rule, came down from the sky.
How is that usually interpreted? Like metaphorically? Stars or gods?
Some scholars do lean that way,
Yeah.
Maybe symbols of constellations, or just a poetic way of saying they were divinely appointed, like gods. But that mysterious archive we consulted, it takes a much more literal approach.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, pulling from that archive, because it connects these pre-flood kings directly to the Anunnaki.
The Anunnaki. That name pops up all over Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The translation usually given is something like, "those who from the heavens came to earth."
Sounds pretty direct.
It does. And importantly, the way they're often described in these texts, especially in the interpretations from the archive, they aren't really ethereal gods. They're portrayed more like physical beings, flesh and blood.
Real entities. Where did they supposedly come from?
According to those sources, a planet called Nibiru. Now, Nibiru isn't in our standard astronomical charts. Obviously, it's controversial.
Yeah.
But in Sumerian cosmology, it's often called the 12th planet, counting the sun and moon. And it's said to have this incredibly long elliptical orbit, maybe 3,600 years long.
3,600 years for one orbit.
Wow. And why come here? What was the mission, according to the archive's interpretation of the texts?
Gold. Seems mundane, almost, but the reason given is fascinating. Apparently, they needed gold, possibly monatomic gold, to repair their own planet's atmosphere, or maybe for energy tech. Something vital was failing back home.
So they came here as miners, essentially.
Miners, colonists, rulers. The texts, as interpreted by Sitchin and others in that archive, describe them physically arriving, sky ships, fire and thunder, setting up bases, establishing a hierarchy, a royal family even.
And they didn't just rule, they taught us.
That's the claim. Taught humanity writing, math, astronomy, agriculture, building techniques. Basically kickstarted civilization as we know it. They gave us the tools. Designed the system, you could say.
Okay, but how does this connect back to those insane lifespans in the King List?
Well, here's the direct link. The Anunnaki themselves in these texts are described as having incredibly long lifespans, like really long. Some sources in the archive estimate their lifespan maybe 36,000 Earth years. 36,000. That matches one of those reigns we mentioned.
Exactly. It maps directly onto Olajar's reign length. And one orbit of Nibiru, that 3,600-year period, is called a Sar in Sumerian. The reign lengths in the SKL are often multiples of SARs, or other Sigittic and astronomical numbers. Suddenly, the impossible numbers on the list start looking, well, less impossible, if you accept the premise of these incredibly long-lived beings being the rulers, if it's their timescale, not ours.
So it's not necessarily about human kings living forever, but about non-human kings with naturally vast lifespans.
That's one major interpretation from the archive, yes. But there's another layer, too. Maybe it's not just literal lifespans. Maybe those numbers are also a code.
A code, like hidden information.
Precisely. Some researchers studying these texts, especially those focused on the mathematics and astronomy, propose that the Sumerians, being masters of both, might have embedded astronomical data or cosmic cycles into the reign lengths, a kind of hidden calendar.
How would that work?
There's this idea of a mathematical key, or a reduction system. You take those huge reign numbers, like Alulon's 28,800 years, then you divide it by 360. The Sumerians used a 360-day calendar for many calculations, based on their sexagesimal base 60 math system.
Okay, 28,800 divided by 360, what do you get?
You get 80 years. A perfectly normal human lifespan, especially for an important figure back then.
Whoa. And does that work for others?
It works surprisingly often for the pre-flood kings. The huge numbers reduce down to values like 72, 80, 100. Figures that often resonate with human lifespans or significant celestial cycles, like the precession of the equinoxes where 1 degree takes roughly 72 years.
So it's like a mathematical cipher hiding relatable time periods within the giant numbers. That's clever. And it fits the start date, too.
It aligns remarkably well. If you apply this system, the start date for the list comes out around 3684 BCE, which is very close to the conventionally accepted start of sophisticated Sumerian culture around 3500 BCE. It suggests a deliberate, sophisticated encoding.
Okay, my mind is officially a little blown here. There's more, isn't there? Something about nines.
Ah, yes, the Pythagorean nines, or the magic constant of 9. This is another layer of potential encoding, some researchers point out. If you take most of those pre-flood reign numbers and reduce them using numerology, just adding the digits together repeatedly until you get a single digit.
Like 28,800 becomes 2 plus 8 plus 8 plus 0 plus 0 plus 18, then 1 plus 8 equals 9.
Exactly. You keep doing that, and an astonishing number of those pre-flood reigns reduce down to the number 9.
And 9 is significant in, like, esoteric tradition.
Very significant. Across many ancient cultures and philosophies, 9 represents completion, wholeness, cosmic order. Think of Nikola Tesla's obsession with 3, 6, and 9 as keys to the universe, energy, frequency, vibration. The idea is that the Sumerians might have embedded this fundamental constant of reality into their king list.
Wow. So a historical record, a cosmic calendar, and a numerological key all rolled into one document.
Potentially. But here's a twist. Just before the flood, the last couple of kings listed, their reigns don't reduce to 9.
Oh. What do they reduce to?
They reduce to 3 and 6.
3 and 6, Tesla's other numbers.
Right. And the interpretation from the archive. This shift away from the stable 9 just before the flood might be a deliberate signal, a hint embedded in the numbers themselves that something was wrong. Celestial disturbances, cosmic issues, the order was breaking down. A warning of the coming cataclysm.
That's incredible. It's like they were trying to tell future generations something vital, but hiding it in plain sight.
That's the theory, that this knowledge wasn't meant for just anyone. It was encoded in an esoteric fashion for the initiated to understand. A hidden wisdom, protected within the numbers, suggesting the ancients understood reality on a much deeper level than we usually give them credit for.
So let's go back to the flood itself then. If it wasn't just a random act of nature, what was it according to this archive and texts like Atrahasis?
It's framed as a direct result of Anunnaki politics, an internal conflict.
A war in heaven almost.
Pretty much. You had Enlil's, often portrayed as the stricter, more authoritarian leader. He apparently got fed up with humans. Too noisy, too numerous, maybe getting too independent. He decided to wipe the slate clean. Total reset.
Just eliminate humanity.
That was supposedly the plan. But then you have Enki. He's often seen as the creator figure, the genetic scientist. Maybe he had more of a connection to humanity.
Yeah.
He disagreed, defied Enlil.
And he warned someone, like the Sumerian Noah.
Exactly. He secretly warned Ziusudra, told him to build a boat, gather animals, save the seed of humanity, just like the Noah story, or Napishtim and Gilgamesh. Enki basically ensures our survival against Enlil's orders.
So the Great Flood becomes this pivotal event driven by a power struggle between these higher beings, with humanity caught right in the middle.
That's the narrative presented in these sources. These profound resets aren't just about geology or climate. They're potentially the fallout from conflicts on a much higher level, shaping our destiny in ways we're only beginning to piece together by looking at these unconventional clues. Okay, so the Great Flood was reset number one, a massive event tied to these Anunnaki conflicts. But it wasn't the end of the story, was it? The archive points to another reset, a second one.
That's right. And this one seems to mark the final, abrupt end of Sumerian civilization as a dominant force. It's distinct from the Great Flood, happening much later.
Do we have a date for this second event?
Remarkably, yes. Mainstream archaeology actually pinpoints a widespread collapse and abandonment of sites across southern Mesopotamia around 2024 BCE. Something catastrophic clearly happened then.
2024 BCE, that's very specific. What does the archive suggest caused this collapse? Not another flood?
No, something different, something stranger. The conclusion drawn from the texts and interpretations in the archive is that this wasn't a natural disaster in the usual sense. It was caused by, and this is how the ancient texts describe it, a mysterious cloud or an evil wind that brought sudden, deadly destruction.
An evil wind? What does that even mean? Like a plague?
Yeah.
A chemical weapon? The lamentation texts from that period, the Lament, the lament for Sumer and are heartbreaking. They mourn this sudden death blowing in from the west, wiping out life, withering plants, poisoning the water. It sounds unnatural.
And this is where the most startling theory from the archive comes in, isn't it? From researchers like Zecharia Sitchin.
Yes, this is the really challenging part. Sitchin and others propose, based on their reading of the text and other evidence, that this evil wind, this weapon of terror, was a nuclear weapon.
A nuclear weapon. In 2024 BCE, that's hard to even process.
It is. It fundamentally challenges everything we think we know about ancient technology. But that's the interpretation presented. Not metaphorical destruction, but literal atomic-level devastation.
Why? Why would anyone use such a weapon back then? What was the target?
Again, it comes back to those alleged Anunnaki conflicts. Rival factions fighting for control of Earth. The theory goes that the weapon, or maybe multiple weapons, were used primarily to destroy a major Anunnaki spaceport believed to be located on the Sinai Peninsula.
A spaceport in the Sinai.
That's the hypothesis based on textual interpretations. And maybe also targeting rebellious human cities allied with the opposing faction. Perhaps cities like Sodom and Gomorrah, whose destruction by fire from the sky is mentioned in other ancient traditions.
So the primary target was maybe military or strategic, but the fallout?
The fallout was catastrophic. The prevailing winds in that region blow eastwards from the Sinai towards Mesopotamia. So the theory is this radioactive cloud, the evil wind, drifted over Sumer and Akkad.
And caused the devastation described in the laments.
Exactly. Terrible death to humans, animals, plants, poisoning the land and water for a long time afterwards. The descriptions in the laments, a silent, invisible killer, a virulent cloud, unlike any normal storm, sound chillingly similar to descriptions of radioactive fallout.
Is there any physical evidence to back up such an extraordinary claim beyond the texts?
Well, this is where it gets really intriguing, and where the archive points to specific geological anomalies. First, on the Sinai Peninsula itself, there are large areas covered in blackened, scorched stones, tephra-like material. But there are no volcanoes there.
No volcanoes. So what could scorch rocks like that over vast areas?
Exactly. It suggests an incredibly intense heat event, not volcanic in origin, something powerful enough to blacken the very landscape.
Okay. What else?
Then there's a phenomenon of vitrified sand, finding large slabs of desert sand fused into glass. This requires immense temperatures, over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than a simple fire or even lightning strikes generally produce over large areas.
Where do you find this vitrified sand?
In several desert locations around the world, but also, intriguingly, sometimes high up on mountains where you wouldn't expect such heat. The archive cites this vitrification as potential physical evidence consistent with the heat flash of ancient nuclear explosions.
So scorched earth and melted sand. It's compelling, if incredibly disturbing. Are there parallels in other ancient stories?
There are, strikingly so. The ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, contains incredibly vivid passages describing a devastating weapon and its effects.
What does it say?
It describes a blast, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns. It talks about the aftermath, warriors' hair and nails falling out, pottery breaking without cause, birds falling dead from the sky, food becoming poisoned.
Hair and nails falling out. That sounds exactly like radiation sickness.
It's an unnervingly precise match to the effects of nuclear fallout. The descriptions are so graphic, so specific, it's hard to dismiss them as pure poetic fancy.
Isn't there also a site in India, Mohenjo-Daro, with high radiation levels?
Yes, that's often brought up in this context. Mohenjo-Daro, part of the Indus Valley civilization, reports suggest unusually high radiation levels persist there even today, thousands of years later. There are claims of archaeological evidence, like skeletons found huddled together as if caught by sudden death, and speculation about vitrification, though mainstream archaeology offers different explanations for the site's demise, like climate change or invasion.
But the radiation claims persist.
They do, along with stories of increased rates of birth defects and cancer in the surrounding areas, attributed by some to that ancient radiation. It fuels the theory that maybe an atomic event happened there long, long ago, some dated as far back as 8,000 or even 12,000 BCE.
So you put the Sumerian laments, the Sinai evidence, the vitrified sand, the Mahabharata descriptions, Mohenjo-Daro. It paints a picture, doesn't it?
It paints a very provocative picture. It leads to the idea, central to this archive's perspective, that the atomic bombs of 1945 weren't the first time such power was unleashed on Earth.
That it was maybe a rediscovery, a replication of lost ancient technology.
Exactly. That this kind of power has existed here before, led to catastrophe, was lost or hidden, and then eventually resurfaced in our modern era. A cycle of knowledge, destruction, and forgetting.
It's a staggering thought. And if there's even a possibility this is true, why isn't it headline news? Why the silence from mainstream history and archaeology?
Well, think about the implications. If true, it completely shatters the established timeline of human technological development. It suggests advanced civilizations, possibly non-human or guided by non-humans, existed thousands of years before we currently believe possible.
It would mean rewriting everything.
Everything. Our origins, our progress, our place in the universe. It introduces factors ancient astronauts, lost technologies, cosmic wars that most mainstream disciplines are simply not equipped or willing to deal with. It's too disruptive. So the archive argues it's easier to dismiss the evidence as misinterpretation, myth, or anomaly, rather than confront the paradigm shift it would demand.
So we have the Great Flood as Reset 1, and this potential nuclear event around 2024 BCE as Reset 2, devastating Sumer. But the final end of Sumer wasn't just one single blow, was it? It sounds like these big events triggered a slower, longer decline.
Absolutely. A cataclysm like that, whether nuclear or something else, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It creates conditions for further breakdown. The long shadow, as you put it, involved more conventional factors piling on top of the initial trauma.
Like what? What else contributed to Sumer fading away?
Well, climate change was a big one. Hitting right around that same period, 25 years ago, or 2024 BCE. There's solid evidence for sudden, severe drying across the region. Droughts, dust storms.
Making farming much harder.
Exactly. For a civilization built on irrigation agriculture in southern Mesopotamia, that's devastating. It leads to famine, instability, people abandoning cities. The environment itself turned hostile, compounding whatever destruction came before.
And politically, things weren't exactly stable either, right? Even before 2024 BCE.
No. The Akkadian Empire, which had unified Sumer under Sargon a few centuries earlier, was already crumbling. His successors faced constant revolts, invasions. The empire was shrinking, losing control.
And then came the Gutians.
Right. Around 2154 BCE, these mountain tribes, the Gutians, swept down from the Zagros Mountains. They finished off the Akkadian state, sacked the capital Agade so badly we still don't know exactly where it was.
That sounds like chaos. Did they rule Sumer effectively?
Not really, according to the records. The King List calls it a time when no king was famous, suggesting anarchy. The Gutians are listed as having 21 kings over about 124 years, but the Sumerians viewed them as savages, outsiders who just raided for tribute rather than truly governing. It was a period of fragmentation and decline.
But Sumer had a comeback after that, didn't it? A last hurrah.
It did. A ruler named Utu-Higal of Uruk finally rallied the Sumerians and kicked the Gutians out. This led to the third dynasty of Ur, sometimes called the Neo-Sumerian Empire. It was a brief but brilliant renaissance around 2112 to 2004 BCE, a resurgence of Sumerian language, culture, power.
So why didn't that last? What finally ended it?
Even that renaissance couldn't stop longer-term trends. For centuries, nomadic peoples called the Amorites have been migrating into Mesopotamia from the west. There were Semitic speakers, different culturally.
Were they invaders?
More like persistent migrants, gradually settling, sometimes taking over towns. Even during the third dynasty of Ur, kings were building walls trying to keep them out, but it wasn't working. By the end, Amorite chieftains controlled many areas within Sumer.
So the empire was weakening from within.
Yes, fragmented by Amorite settlement, possibly strained by the earlier environmental and maybe catastrophic damage. The final blow came around 2004 BCE when the Elamites from the east invaded, sacked the capital city of Ur, and dragged away the last Sumerian king, Ibbi-Sin.
And that was it, the end of Sumer.
That was the end of Sumer as an independent political entity. This civilization that gave us so much just faded from the map. And with the political collapse came a cultural one, or at least a transformation. Sumerian, the language. It started to die out as a spoken language.
Replaced by what? Amorite?
Mostly Akkadian, which was already widely spoken and probably influenced by Amorite too. By around 1800 BCE, Sumerian wasn't really spoken day-to-day anymore. It survived only as a kind of classical language, like Latin in medieval Europe, used by scribes and priests for religious texts and literature. But the living connection was broken.
So a linguistic reset, too.
Definitely. And out of that mixed Sumerian heritage, Akkadian language, Amorite people, a new civilization arose, Babylonia. It inherited a lot from Sumer, but it was different. A new chapter, a new identity, another reset, in a way.
But this archive you mentioned, it suggests an even deeper reset happened, didn't it? Something beyond language or politics, something to do with us, humanity itself.
Yes. This is perhaps the most profound and unsettling idea presented. That the Anunnaki didn't just kickstart civilization and then leave. They fundamentally programmed humanity.
Programmed us? How? For what?
Remember their alleged initial purpose, according to those texts, creating humans, Homo sapiens, through genetic engineering, mixing their own DNA with Homo erectus.
See workers, right, in the gold mines.
Exactly. Primitive workers, as the texts supposedly call us. Engineered for function, for service, not necessarily for freedom or independent thought. The archive argues that even after the Anunnaki maybe stepped back physically, the system they designed remained.
What kind of system?
A top-down hierarchical system. Reverence for rulers seen as divine or appointed by the divine. Knowledge controlled, kept hidden behind layers of ritual and priesthood. Think about the concept of the divine right of kings, the rigid class structures. Where did those ideas ultimately come from?
The suggestion is they came from the Anunnaki blueprint, that they installed this way of organizing society.
That's the argument, that our natural human tendencies, maybe towards more egalitarian groups, more intuitive spirituality, were deliberately overwritten, replaced by systems emphasizing obedience, hierarchy, dogma.
Like a societal operating system was installed.
That's a good analogy. And it was designed, perhaps, to make us forget our true origins or our true potential, to keep us focused on work, on survival, on following orders, rather than questioning the nature of reality or the source of authority. A programming in comfort, maybe, so we wouldn't rock the boat?
That's a heavy thought. That our societal structures might be inherited programming from non-human creators with their own agenda.
It is. It reframes so much of human history and our present condition. How much of our drive for hierarchy, for control, for endless work, is it truly ours, or is it an echo of that ancient design?
But you mentioned a note of mystery, a glimmer of hope in this, something about Enki again.
Right. Even within this narrative of control, Enki stands out. The supposed creator figure, the one who defied Enlil to save us from the flood. Some interpretations in the archive suggest he didn't just save us physically.
What else did he do?
Maybe he embedded something within us. Seeds of resistance, perhaps coded into our DNA, hidden in our myths. A spark of awareness, of creativity, of rebellion against that control system.
A potential to wake up, to remember.
Perhaps. A potential to eventually understand our origins, and maybe even, as some texts hint, surpass our creators. It leaves the door open, doesn't it? That despite the resets, despite the programming, something uniquely human, maybe something divinely inspired by Enki, remains, waiting to fully emerge. Are we finally reaching a point where we can access that potential?
That's a tantalizing question.
Well, That really brings us to the end of this particular deep dive. We've gone from thousand-year reigns on the Sumerian King List, through cosmic codes and Anunnaki conflicts, to the Great Flood, and then this potential second nuclear reset.
And finally, to the idea that maybe humanity itself was reset or programmed in some fundamental way. It's a lot to process. It definitely challenges the standard story.
It really does. It leaves you staring at the historical timeline completely differently, doesn't it? Wondering about these huge gaps and strange anomalies.
Exactly. And it leaves us, inevitably, with some pretty big questions. Questions that kind of hang in the air after you put the sources down. Absolutely. So, as you, our listeners, mull over everything we've talked about today, we want to leave you with these thoughts to chew on. Do you think these civilization resets we've discussed were directed events, intentional?
And if they were, why? Why would someone or something feel the need to keep resetting the board? Who or what do you think is ultimately behind all this?
These are the kinds of questions that keep us digging, keep us exploring these mysterious archives and unconventional ideas. We hope they spark your curiosity too.
Because the answers, or at least the clues, often seem to be hidden in plain sight, just waiting for us to look at them with fresh eyes, beyond the accepted narrative.
That's so true. And hey, if you found this dive fascinating, please do explore the rest of our channel. We've got deep dives into all sorts of other intriguing topics, ancient mysteries, future tech, consciousness. Lots to explore.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and curiosity is key.
Stay curious, look for answers. They are always there somewhere. You just have to know where to look.